I never truly understood the meaning of a gut feeling until I saw my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, standing in the middle of his backyard at 3 o'clock in the morning in a pair of heavy work boots and a yellow raincoat, despite the fact that there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. Most people in our quiet suburban circle thought he was just a quirky retiree with a passion for gardening. But as I stood there behind my darkened bedroom curtains, I realized that no sane person mows their lawn in total darkness without a single light to guide their way. The silence of the neighborhood was thick and suffocating, yet I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a manual reel mower cutting through the grass, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of my own house. I remember wondering why he wouldn't just wait until the sun came up like a normal human being, or why he felt the need to wear such heavy gear when the temperature was sitting at a humid 75 degrees. There was something fundamentally wrong with the way he moved, his body stiff and mechanical as he pushed that mower back and forth across a patch of dirt that had long since been stripped of any actual grass. As the weeks went by, my curiosity turned into a slow-burning dread that sat in the pit of my stomach every time the sun began to dip below the horizon. I started keeping a log of his activities, noticing that he wasn't just mowing the same empty patch of dirt every night, but was actually digging deep, narrow trenches that he would fill back in before the first light of dawn touched the trees. Why would a man spend his golden years burying things in the middle of the night while his neighbors slept soundly just a few yards away? I found myself unable to sleep, my eyes glued to the sliver of space between my blinds, waiting for that yellow raincoat to appear like a ghost in the moonlight. One Tuesday night, the air felt particularly heavy, and the usual cricket song had gone completely silent, leaving a void that was filled only by the scraping of a metal shovel against the rocky soil next door. I watched as Mr. Henderson dragged a heavy, translucent plastic bag from his garage toward the newest trench, his breath coming in ragged, audible gasps that I could hear even through my double-paned windows. The bag was awkwardly shaped and seemed much heavier than simple yard waste, sagging in the middle as he struggled to keep it from snagging on the rose bushes. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird because I noticed a splash of dark, muddy red smeared across the side of the plastic, glinting under the pale glow of the moon. I told myself it was just fertilizer or perhaps some kind of organic mulch, but the way he handled it, with a mixture of reverence and frantic haste, suggested something far more sinister than gardening. I leaned closer to the glass, my forehead pressing against the cold surface, trying to see if I could identify anything inside that bag before he rolled it into the earth. Suddenly, he stopped moving entirely, his back still turned to me, and he stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. My breath hitched in my throat as he slowly, very slowly, began to rotate his head toward my house, his eyes scanning the dark windows with a predatory intensity that made me drop to the floor instantly. I laid there on the carpet, my heart thumping so loudly I was certain he could hear it through the walls, and I realized that I had made a terrible mistake by being so visible. I heard the sound of the shovel resuming its work, but this time, the rhythm was faster, more aggressive, as if he knew he was being timed or perhaps watched by an unseen witness. I stayed on the floor for hours, paralyzed by the thought of him standing on the other side of that fence, staring at my house with that shovel in his hand. When the sun finally rose, I gathered the courage to look out again, and the backyard was perfectly flat, the dirt smoothed over and covered with a fresh layer of straw as if nothing had happened at all. I decided then that I couldn't just sit in my room and wonder anymore, so I waited until I saw his old truck pull out of the driveway to run errands before I made my move. I climbed over the low wooden fence that separated our properties, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly tripped over a stray garden hose. The air in his backyard smelled strange, sweet and metallic all at once, and the ground felt soft and spongy under my sneakers, like a mattress that had been left out in the rain. I reached the spot where the bag had been buried and began to kick away the straw, looking for any sign of what lay beneath the surface. I didn't have a shovel, so I used a sturdy stick to poke at the loose earth, and only a few inches down, the wood struck something soft and yielding. I pushed harder, and a corner of that same translucent plastic poked through the dirt, stained with that same dark, crusty substance that I now realized was definitely not fertilizer. Just as I was about to rip the plastic open to see the truth, the distant sound of a truck engine echoing down the street sent a jolt of pure electricity through my spine. He was back early, and I was standing in the middle of his garden, with the evidence of his crimes half uncovered at my feet. I scrambled back over the fence, my lungs burning as I dived through my back door and locked it just as his tires crunched onto the gravel of his driveway. I watched through the peephole as he walked toward his backyard, his eyes immediately darting to the disturbed straw and the small hole I had made in the earth. He didn't look angry. Instead, a slow, terrifying smile spread across his face, and he looked directly at my back door as if he could see through the solid wood. That night, the tension in the air was so thick it felt like I was breathing underwater, and I knew that he wasn't going to spend this night gardening. I checked every lock in the house twice, pushed a heavy chair against the front door, and retreated to my bedroom with a kitchen knife held tightly in my hand. Around midnight, the power suddenly went out, plunging my entire house into a darkness so complete that I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. I heard the floorboards in the hallway creak, a sound that shouldn't have been there because I was supposed to be the only person in the house. Then, the sound of the manual reel mower started up again, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the basement, the metallic whirring echoing up through the air vents like a mechanical growl. He hadn't broken in through a door or a window. He had been using the old coal chute in the basement that I had forgotten to bolt shut weeks ago. I realized with a jolt of horror that he had been watching me just as much as I had been watching him, and he had been waiting for the perfect moment to move the garden inside. I crawled toward the window, thinking I could jump out onto the porch roof, but when I pulled the blinds back, I saw his yellow raincoat draped over the railing, swaying in the wind like a warning. The basement door at the end of the hall began to groan on its hinges, and the smell of that sweet, metallic earth filled my nostrils, making me gag. I knew I had seconds to act before he reached the top of the stairs, so I grabbed my heavy ceramic lamp and stood by the bedroom door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my chest. As the door began to swing open, a dark silhouette filled the frame, and the moonlight caught the edge of a long, serrated garden blade. I didn't wait for him to speak or move. I swung the lamp with every ounce of strength I had, feeling it shatter against something hard as I shoved past the figure and sprinted toward the stairs. I didn't take the stairs one by one. I practically fell down them, my feet barely touching the carpet as I raced toward the front door and threw the heavy chair aside. I burst out into the night air, screaming for help at the top of my lungs, my voice breaking the silence of the neighborhood like a gunshot. Lights began to flicker on in the surrounding houses, and I saw my other neighbors peering out, their faces pale and confused in the shadows. I didn't stop running until I reached the middle of the street, where I collapsed onto the asphalt, pointing back at my house where the front door stood wide open. By the time the police arrived and searched the property, Mr. Henderson was nowhere to be found, but they did find the basement filled with the same plastic bags I had seen in the yard. Inside were the remains of the neighborhood pets that had gone missing over the last year, along with several large containers of industrial-grade lye that he had been using to process his garden. They never found him, but sometimes when the wind is just right and the moon is full, I think I can still hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a real mower turning in the dark, and I know that he is still out there, looking for a new patch of dirt to call his own. I should have known that giving a spare key to my neighbor, Arthur, was the first step in a slow-motion disaster that would eventually rob me of my peace of mind and my sense of security. He seemed like the perfect candidate for a designated key holder, a soft-spoken, middle-aged man who spent his weekends meticulously painting birdhouses and who always checked my mail whenever I went out of town for business. You never know when a pipe might burst or a stove might be left on. He had told me with a gentle, reassuring smile that made me feel foolish for even hesitating to hand over the brass duplicate. For the first few months, everything seemed perfectly normal, but then I began to notice the small, almost imperceptible changes in my living room that I initially dismissed as symptoms of my own exhaustion. A picture frame on the mantel would be tilted just a fraction of a degree to the left, or my favorite coffee mug would be sitting on the second shelf of the cabinet instead of the third where I always kept it. These were the kinds of things that make you question your own memory, the tiny glitches in reality that you laugh off until they start happening every single day without fail. The atmosphere in my home began to shift from a place of comfort to a space that felt strangely crowded, even when I was standing in the middle of the foyer completely alone. I would come home from work and feel a lingering scent in the air, a faint, medicinal smell mixed with the aroma of cheap peppermint that definitely didn't belong to any of my cleaning products or candles. One evening, I sat down on my sofa and realized the cushions were still slightly warm, as if someone had been sitting exactly where I was only moments before I walked through the front door. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around the silent room, the shadows stretching long and thin across the hardwood floors as the sun began to set behind the oak trees outside. I called out Arthur's name, thinking perhaps he had come in to check on a supposed leak, but the only response was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I decided to change the location of my spare key, hiding it in a kitchen drawer instead of leaving it with him. But when I checked my bedside table the next morning, my watch was missing from its usual spot. The realization that Arthur wasn't just entering my house when I was away, but was likely inside while I was present, sent a cold shiver down my spine that I couldn't shake off no matter how high I turned the heat. I started staying up late, sitting in the dark with my back against the headboard, listening to the house settle and straining my ears for the sound of a key turning in the lock. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a footstep, and every rustle of the wind against the siding sounded like a whispered conversation just out of reach. I found myself wondering how many times he had stood in the doorway of my bedroom while I was deep in sleep, watching the steady rise and fall of my chest in the moonlight. Why would a man with his own home and his own life feel the need to inhabit the corners of mine like a parasite? The questions circled my mind like vultures, picking away at my nerves until I was jumping at the sound of my own shadow. One Friday night, the tension finally reached a breaking point when I decided to pretend I was leaving for a weekend trip to see if I could catch him in the act. I packed a small suitcase, made a show of locking the front door, and drove my car around the block before parking it 3 streets over and walking back through the woods behind my property. I slipped inside through the back window I had purposely left unlatched and hid myself inside the deep, dark shadows of the walk-in pantry in the kitchen. I waited for hours in the cramped space, the smell of dry pasta and spices filling my nose as my legs began to cramp from the awkward position. Just as I was about to give up and conclude that I was being paranoid, I heard the unmistakable metallic click of the front door lock being engaged from the inside. The heavy footsteps that followed were slow and deliberate, moving with a familiarity that suggested the intruder knew exactly where every piece of furniture was located in the dark. I peered through the narrow gap in the pantry door and saw the silhouette of a man standing in the center of my kitchen. his head tilted as if he were listening to the heartbeat of the house. It was Arthur, but he didn't look like the gentle birdhouse painter anymore. He looked like a king surveying his kingdom, his shoulders squared and his movements confident. He walked over to the refrigerator, opened it, and took a long drink from a carton of orange juice before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and placing it back on the shelf. Then he did something that made the blood freeze in my veins. He walked over to the kitchen table, sat in my chair, and began to mimic my exact posture, resting his chin on his hand and staring at the empty seat across from him. He started talking in a low, hushed whisper, carrying on a one-sided conversation with an imaginary version of me, apologizing for the mess and promising that things would be better soon. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that he wasn't just visiting. He was practicing a life that wasn't his, and I was the only obstacle standing in the way of his delusion. He stood up and began to walk toward the pantry, his eyes fixed on the very door I was hiding behind, and I knew I had to move or be trapped like an animal. I waited until he turned his back to grab a knife from the magnetic strip on the wall, and I bolted from the pantry, sprinting toward the back window with everything I had. He let out a primal, guttural roar of frustration and lunged for my ankle, his fingers grazing the fabric of my jeans as I scrambled through the window frame and onto the wet grass outside. I didn't look back as I sprinted through the trees, the branches scratching at my face and arms, until I reached the safety of the streetlights where several cars were passing by. I flagged down a passing motorist who called the police, and within minutes, the quiet street was flooded with the blue and red glow of emergency lights. When the officers entered my home, they found that Arthur had vanished through the front door, but they discovered something in the attic that made the lead investigator turn pale. Arthur had carved a small hole in the ceiling of my bedroom closet, hidden behind a suitcase, which allowed him to climb down from the attic directly into my room whenever he pleased. He had been living in the crawl space above my head for weeks, surrounded by photographs he had taken of me while I was sleeping and personal items he had borrowed over the months. The spare key I had given him was just a formality. He had already made himself a permanent resident of the shadows in my home. The police searched his house and found a literal shrine dedicated to the lives of several people in the neighborhood, all of whom had at one point trusted him with a key or a favor. Arthur was never caught, as he seemingly walked into the woods that night and disappeared into the vast, dark wilderness that bordered our town. I moved out of that house the following week, leaving behind most of my furniture and anything that he might have touched or breathed upon. Now, in my new apartment, I have 3 different deadbolts on every door and a security system that alerts my phone every time a window is even touched. But sometimes, when the sun goes down and the house gets quiet, I still catch myself looking at the picture frames on the wall, checking to see if they've been tilted just a fraction of a degree to the left. And every time I hear a floorboard creak in the middle of the night, I wonder if Arthur finally found a new neighbor who was kind enough to offer him a spare key. I never thought that the smell of wet cement would eventually become the scent of my own nightmares, but that was before my neighbor, Elias, decided to renovate his backyard in the middle of a record-breaking monsoon season. He was a massive, silent man with hands the size of dinner plates and a brow that seemed perpetually locked in a deep, brooding scowl. While every other resident on our street was hunkered down inside waiting for the torrential rains to pass, Elias was out there in a heavy rubber apron, lugging bags of concrete mix as if they weighed nothing at all. The most disturbing part wasn't his dedication to the project, but the fact that he only seemed to work when the visibility was at its lowest and the sound of the pouring rain drowned out everything else. I would sit by my kitchen window and watch him through the gray sheets of water, his silhouette illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning as he smoothed out the thick, gray sludge of his new porch. It was an enormous structure, far larger than any porch needed to be, and it sat directly against the fence line that bordered my property. As the days turned into weeks, a foul, cloying odor began to rise from the direction of his yard, a smell that was far too sweet to be mud and far too pungent to be simple, stagnant water. I noticed that Elias had started carrying heavy-duty cleaning supplies into his garage, bottles of bleach and industrial-strength deodorizers that he would stack by the dozen on his workbench. One afternoon, he caught me staring at the pile of chemicals from my driveway, and instead of nodding a greeting, he walked over to the fence with a bottle of lime-scented spray in his hand. "The rain brings out the rot in the old soil," he said, his voice sounding like two heavy stones grinding together in the dark. He reached over the fence and handed me a jug of the same bleach he was using, telling me that I should scrub my own foundation before the scent moved into my house too. His eyes were bloodshot and didn't seem to blink, and I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my chest as I realized he was testing me to see if I had noticed the stench. The curiosity began to gnaw at me until I couldn't focus on anything else, especially when I saw him dragging a heavy, rolled-up rug toward the wet cement late on a Thursday night. The rug was thick and expensive-looking, but it was tied shut at both ends with heavy nylon rope, and Elias was moving it with a level of care that seemed entirely out of character for a man of his size. I watched as he lowered the rug into a deep trench he had dug in the center of the porch's footprint, and then he immediately began to dump wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of fresh concrete over the top of it. My mind raced with questions that I was too terrified to answer, wondering who or what could be inside that rug, and why he was so desperate to seal it under 6 inches of solid stone. I knew that the woman who lived with him, a quiet person I hadn't seen in over a month, was supposedly visiting relatives in another state, but the timeline of her departure didn't match the arrival of the concrete. The tension reached a boiling point when Elias invited me over for a celebratory dinner to mark the completion of his construction project. I wanted to refuse, but the look in his eyes suggested that a rejection would be seen as a confirmation of my suspicions. So I walked across the soggy lawn with my heart hammering against my ribs. The air inside his house was thick with the smell of incense and bleach, a combination that made my eyes water and my throat feel tight. He led me out to the back porch, which was now a vast, gray expanse of hardened concrete that looked like a tombstone laid flat across the earth. We sat at a small metal table right in the center of the slab, and as he began to carve a piece of overcooked meat, I looked down and saw something that made my breath stop in my lungs. A small, jagged piece of floral patterned fabric was poking out through a tiny air bubble in the concrete right next to my chair. It was the exact same pattern as the dress his wife had been wearing the last time I saw her waving from the driveway. I tried to keep my hands from shaking as I reached for my water glass, but Elias noticed my gaze and stopped carving, the long serrated knife glinting under the dim porch light. "Is something wrong with the architecture?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper that made the hair on my arms stand up. I realized that he had positioned me directly over the spot where he had buried the rug, a psychological game designed to see if I would break under the pressure of the truth. I forced a smile and told him the porch looked incredibly solid, but he didn't return the smile. Instead, he stood up and began to walk around the table toward me, the knife still held firmly in his grip. I knew that if I didn't move right that second, I would become a permanent part of his next renovation project in the garden. I stood up so quickly that my chair flipped backward, clattering against the hard stone, and I pointed toward his garage and shouted that I saw smoke coming from under the door. It was a desperate, simple distraction, but it worked for the 2 seconds I needed to bolt toward the side gate. I didn't run for my own house because I knew he would expect that. Instead, I scrambled over the front fence and sprinted toward the main road where I knew a police cruiser usually sat near the intersection. I could hear his heavy boots thumping on the pavement behind me, his breath coming in loud, angry huffs as he gained ground with every stride. I reached the police car just as Elias rounded the corner, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage that vanished the moment he saw the blue and red lights. He stopped dead in his tracks and began to laugh, a dry, hacking sound that echoed off the nearby houses as he raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. The officers were confused at first, but when they saw my face and the way I was pointing back at the porch, they decided to bring in a forensic team to examine the site. It took them 6 hours to jackhammer through the reinforced concrete, but what they found beneath the surface confirmed my darkest fears. The rug wasn't empty, and it wasn't the only thing he had buried in that yard over the years he had lived on our street. They found evidence of several projects that dated back nearly a decade, all hidden under layers of stone and brick that he had laid with his own 2 hands. Elias was taken into custody that night, but even as they led him away in handcuffs, he kept staring at me with that same bloodshot gaze, whispering that the concrete would never truly be dry. I sold my house a month later at a massive loss because I couldn't stand the sight of a construction crew or the smell of a rainy afternoon. Now, whenever I see someone working on their home, I don't see a neighbor improving their property. I see a man building a fortress for his secrets, and I make sure to never, ever look too closely at the foundation.